Welcome everybody, it's Spessy, and today we're looking at the top 5 cards from every ink colour in Azurite Sea. So we're looking at 30 different cards. Big shout out to Card Market who sponsor the channel. Great place to buy singles online in Europe. We're starting off with Steel, and we're starting off with a legendary card. So in my opinion, the 5th best card in Steel for Azurite Sea is Wreck-It Ralph Ham Hands. It is a legendary, of course. Don't forget, in set 5 we have this new glossy style applied to the legendaries where the card has that kind of little gloss around Wreck-It Ralph. You can see where his fingers are here. Like, this is going to be like a little glossy effect. So the non-foil versions of these legendary cards look particularly good. I revealed this card and I was instantly pretty interested. There was definitely some split opinions on this card when I spoke with some of the best pro players, but in my opinion, it's got so much potential. Great stat line for Wreck-It Ralph, with 4 strength, of course, going to be out of the range of Madame Medusa, which is always a very big deal. And it quests for 3, and it's got 4 willpower. I Wreck Things is the ability. Whenever this character quests, you may banish chosen item or location to gain 2 lore. So that's going to include your own, but also your opponent's. So if your opponent's got a Queen's Castle down on the board, well, you can quest with Wreck-It Ralph, remove the Queen's Castle, and you'll gain 5 lore at the same time, which is absolutely absurd. So the power level potential of Wreck-It Ralph is huge. So why is it not higher in the list? Why is it only creeping into the video at the 5th spot for Steel? Well, it's uninkable and it costs 6, which uninkable 6 cost characters is where things start to get a little bit awkward and quite difficult to include. For example, if you look at Perdita, a very strong card in Amber from set 3, it has that same kind of issue where 6 cost uninkable means that usually you're going to need some way of ramping up to consistently play the card, whether that's an abundance of card draw by being able to pair this with something like Amethyst, draw lots of cards, ink each turn, whether that's playing Sapphire or perhaps cards like Dock and Lantern in Amber. So Wreck-It Ralph, for example, probably not going to be a card you're able to play in a deck like Steel Ruby, which really doesn't have an abundance of card draw. However, all you really need is for a card like this to be good in one ink color combination, and it can be an absolute menace. And I think Sapphire Steel is the most obvious home for Wreck-It Ralph, but I do think there's some potential for Amber Steel with Lantern and this card as well. So it's one I'm really keeping my eye on. I think Sapphire Steel at the moment, the kind of cycle that Sapphire Steel tends to go through is it has a bit of a slow start and then it can really ramp up the pressure with cards like Tamatoa. Well, Wreck-It Ralph's going to allow you to do that a little bit quicker with Fishbone Quill and things like Tipo. You're going to be able to get Wreck-It Ralph down on turn 4 pretty consistently. And then you're going to be able to quest with Wreck-It Ralph, of course, then on turn 5 to start wrecking things. And the other benefit of playing Sapphire Steel is you've got an abundance of your own items. You can sacrifice a Popsicle, sacrifice a Fortisphere for Wreck-It Ralph to gain 2 extra lore. And of course, that's going to put them in the discard pile ready for your Tamatoa. So shiny. I think this card's really strong. I think it's going to be a very, very powerful card in Sapphire Steel in particular, but possibly elsewhere as well. It is also an enchanted card, and it's because it's a legendary card, not going to be the cheapest. I don't anticipate it to be a card which you necessarily play 4 copies of in your deck, with the fact that it is uninkable and it does have that 6 cost mark, which makes it quite awkward, as I've mentioned. But as a card that you play 2, perhaps 3 copies of, I think it could be an absolutely incredible card and one I'm really, really excited for. The 4th best card, in my opinion, in Steel this set is a bit of a controversial pick, which is the Galactic Council Chamber. This card could prove to be the best card, or it could prove to be completely irrelevant, because it's got a very unique ability and therefore definitely one I wanted to draw your attention to. While you have an alien or robot character here, this location can't be challenged. So this is kind of getting into the realm of what you might call an Exodia combo. Exodia, of course, a very well-known card from Yu-Gi-Oh!, which if you are able to assemble all the parts, you win the game. Now, of course, that's not quite the case of this, but if you're able to get an alien character or robot into the Galactic Council Chamber, and it has evasive, you could, in theory, keep questing each turn with your alien robot. They can't touch your evasive card, they can't touch your Galactic Council Chamber, and then they can't stop you winning the game. And interestingly, there is a card which fits the bill in that sense. It's an Emerald Stitch card, which has ward and has evasive when at a location. So while that doesn't sound that impressive, I think that there's some really interesting things you can do with Galactic Council Chamber. For example, John Silver is an alien. There's a lot of robot characters which have been released this set. There's a lot of decks which are really trying to support this all-out location archetype. And overall, the stats on the card are just very solid in general. 7 willpower, 1 lore for a 3-cost location is pretty good. If you look at the library, I think the library's at 8 willpower. So slightly less willpower than the library, but it also only costs 1 to move in there. And I think that its ability could prove to be really exciting. Overall, I'm still slightly skeptical that this card's actually that good, but its ability is unique and interesting and potentially powerful enough that I had to give it a mention. And next we've got Twin Fire. Twin Fire is very similar to a card like Fire the Cannons, but it costs twice as much, and you're also able to deal twice as much damage. You deal 2 damage to chosen character, like a Baboom or like a Fire the Cannons. Of course, Baboom does have that upside of being inkable and being able to target locations, which does come up more often than you might think. So this is only able to deal with characters, and it's uninkable, but then you may choose and discard a card to deal 2 damage to another chosen character. Now that sounds pretty terrible. Discard a card to deal 2 more damage. Do you really want to do that? Well, if you're playing a card like A Whole New World or Dock, where you're going to be discarding your hand shortly thereafterwards, which of course are both steel cards, I think that's where Twin Fire can be a really incredible option to give you some nice tempo in the early game. You can play like a Maleficent on turn 1, like the Lilo card, which quests for 2 in Amethyst, and then on turn 2 you go for Twin Fire and remove 2 threats of your opponent at once. Okay, you lose a card in hand, but you gain a significant amount of tempo on the board. So for a quick deck which wants to quest and control the board quite early on, this card's going to be tremendous, at least in potential, in my opinion. And also worth mentioning that this can deal with a Diablo that's in a hidden cove. Okay, it's a big price in the form that you have to discard an extra card, but you're going to be very happy to have that option. And of course, you don't have to take that option. Very often, spending 2 ink to deal 2 damage is something that you're not going to be that unhappy to do anyway. I think Baboom is a tremendous card. Okay, it's inkable, and that's a big reason why. This one's uninkable, but with that big potential upside. Not going to be a card you put into every single steel deck, not a chance. But with the right setup, I think Dock in particular, this is one which I'm really excited for. In spot number 2, I can't believe it's not in spot number 1. A lot of people are going to lose their minds. It's Gantu. And a lot of people are going to look at this card and say, Speci, what are you on about? It doesn't have an ability. It doesn't need an ability, everybody. It's 5 cost inkable. I talked about Wreck-It Ralph being a little bit awkward as that kind of 6 cost uninkable. Well, there's a big difference between being 5 cost and 6 cost, because if you don't have any card draw, you don't have any ramp, you're still able to consistently get to 5 ink. If you ink a card each turn, even if you're going first, you play a card on turn 1, you ink a card every turn, you can still get to 5 ink every single time, unless you run into issues with uninkables or you're playing against discard. And it's inkable anyway, so it really can never be that bad. But why is it so good if it has no ability? Well, how do you win a game of this in Lorcana? Unless you're playing mill, it's by questing. And Gantu is very, very, very good at that. 4 lore on Gantu. That is the most lore for any playable card that costs 5 or less. Now, there's some exceptions. There's Flynn Rider in Emerald, who is a 4-cost character which quests for 4, and it's uninkable. But of course, it loses one of those lore pips for every card in your opponent's hand. So it's very rarely questing for 4, and if it does, you're probably already winning the game. Similarly, there's also Mirabelle Madrigal, the set 5 promo card from the championships, which quests for 5, but as we know, you're only able to play that card down on the board if you have, I think, 4 or 5 other characters, so it's rubbish. Gantu has none of those stipulations. It just quests for 4. Many of my viewers will know that Robin Hood Daydreamer, which is a vanilla card, vanilla means no ability, in Emerald, a 6 cost, also quests for 4. Okay, it has better stats, but it's a card I'm a huge fan of. And as I've mentioned, there's a huge difference between being 5 and 6 cost. Not only that, Gantu has 4 strength and 3 willpower, which is just perfect in terms of stats in a lot of ways. Like in terms of balancing, right? The card's questing for 4, so they could have given it like 1 willpower and 5 strength or something like this. But no, it's got 3 willpower, which means it's protected from things like Grab Your Swords, Babooms, Fire the Cannons, and 4 strength to protect it from Madame Medusa and Brawl. You really Couldn't ask for much more in a 5-cost inkable card. Its stats are incredible. But just when you think it can't get better, take a look at the tags. The alien tag, which isn't necessarily completely irrelevant, as we've already seen. There's big benefit potentially for having the alien tag. But even more importantly, it's a captain. And it's a turn 5 captain. You play Mr. Smee on turn 2. You quest with it on turn 3, it takes 1 damage. You quest with it on turn 4, it takes 1 more damage. You quest with it on turn 5, it's about to banish itself, and bam, in comes Captain Cranky Head, and suddenly you've got a captain to keep your Smee on the board. This is an incredible card. In my opinion, one of the best cards of the set. And the fact that it's not first on my list really shows you how good this next card is, because this next card is unbelievable. And it is Calhoun, the Marine Sergeant. Steel arguably already has the best 2-cost character in the game in the form of Mr. Smee, and Calhoun is a contender to take that spot from Mr. Smee. It is uninkable, and it is a rare as well. Mr. Smee a little bit more easily accessible, and of course being a uninkable card is a huge downside compared to Mr. Smee. But look at the stats on this card. It only quests for 1. That is a downside. However, it's got 3 strength and 2 willpower, which is a great stat line, and it has resist 1. So really this card is more like a 3 strength, 3 willpower card in a similar form to Mr. Smee. Arguably even better in a lot of cases with that resist. You know, like a fox can take this out, but if you want to try and deal with this with grab your swords, you're going to need 2 grab your swords to take out a Calhoun. And the ability level up is tremendous as well. During your turn, whenever this character banishes another character in a challenge, gain 2 lore. Very similar to the ability of Robin Hood, Champion of Sherwood, which is a 5-cost legendary card worth like 40 quid or maybe like 30 quid. And we know how good Robin Hood is. And Calhoun has the same ability in a lot of ways. I think this card is obscenely strong. I think it's going to be an auto-include card in most steel decks, if not every single steel deck in the game. It is arguably the best card of the set, which is why it finds itself in the first place. So to summarize steel, Wreck-It Ralph, very strong, new legendary. There's Galactic Council Chamber as an interesting location. There's also another interesting 5-cost uninkable location in steel, worth bearing in mind. Twin Fire in the right deck with Doc is going to be great, but then I think the big 2 standouts for me, Gantu and Calhoun, are just tremendous. Let's move on to Amber. Amber was the first set of cards I covered in yesterday's stream, so I'm going to go over these a little bit more quickly because I think that these are the cards people would have seen me talk about most. In at the 5th spot, this card wouldn't have made the list on a lot of the other ink colors. I think Amber has some very high quality cards, which we're going to be looking at, but a lot of pretty poor cards. And I won't give in sneaks into the list. I don't think it's particularly good at all. You can return a character card with cost 2 or less from your discard to your hand. Probably your best target for this is going to be something like Doc, for example, which is that 2-cost card which discards your hand and lets you draw 2 more cards. Moreover, it's just an inkable song card, which in a sense draws. And if you really think about the options that you have in Amber as Amber songs that are inkable, there isn't an abundance of them. There's Be Our Guest, there's Bare Necessities, which sometimes see play. Bare Necessities is great, but I Won't Give In is for me the second best inkable song now in Amber behind Bare Necessities, and I think it therefore will see some play. Up next, we've got another legendary card in at the 4th spot. I think people might have been expecting this to be a little bit higher up on my list. It's Simba, Pride Protector. 4/4, shift 3, quest for 2, and at the end of your turn, if this character is exerted, you may ready your other characters. Similarly, great stats outside of Medusa range, questing for 2. It is uninkable, it's a prince. Why is this not higher up? Because a lot of people are very excited for this card. I will say I think the art is incredible. If you just forget about the art for a second, all right, just look at the bottom part of the card. Is it really that good? If this card was called something else and had a different picture, would you really think it's that good? I'm not sure that you would. Don't get me wrong, I think it's very strong and it has big potential, but it is a little bit slow. If you play this on turn 5 without the shift, it's not going to be until turn 6 that you can quest at this and have it exerted, and that's quite slow for a card which seems to be supporting a deck which wants to go quite wide in Quest. So in order to really maximize the potential of Simba, you're going to be looking to either shift it or play it with things like Dock, Lantern, or perhaps with Sapphire as well. So that kind of makes it a little bit more awkward. Like, it's not going to be a card that you can just plug and play in every single deck. Now, if you're shifting it, there's also a slight concern I have, which is that Simba rewards you for having lots of characters on the board because you're able to ready lots at once, but the shift kind of counteracts that with the fact that you're removing one of your cheaper characters which would have been able to ready. So there's a bit of anti-synergy in a sense with the shift, and that's fine because there are a lot of cheap Simba cards. But if you look at the cheap Simba cards, none of them are particularly strong. You've got the one cost Steel Simba, which I honestly think might be the best shift option for this because it's also a prince, and I could see a world you play Simba with Pride Lands, which if you have a prince or king at Pride Lands, all of your other characters cost one less. Maybe it could be time for an all-out Pride Lands deck. The best one probably, though, is going to be the 2-cost Bodyguard from set 1, the first chapter, to shift. But I just don't see a world that, you play, let's say, Lilo on turn 1, Simba on turn 2, back to the first chapter, and then shift this Simba on turn 3, and then you get to ready your Lilo. Is that really a big deal? I mean, it's not that big a deal. I think this card's a little bit too slow. I think it's got potential, but I don't think it's as good as people are talking about. However, it does have some really nice synergy with the next card. And this next card could prove to be a lot better than I currently think it will be. And it's Lilo, Escape Artist. It's a super rare, 2-cost inkable with 1/2 stat line, and it quests for 2. No place I'd rather be at the start of your turn. If this card is in your discard, you may play her and she enters play exerted. Now, quickly, important to note, this is not going to happen for free. If you've got Lilo at the end of your turn in your discard, she's not just going to fly out at no cost. You still have to pay ink for her. That's really important to understand when evaluating this card. Otherwise, it would be tremendous. You could go for that Simba card I mentioned on turn 1, discard Lilo from your hand, and then at the start of your next turn, she's just going to summon herself out exerted. Of course, if you can combine this Lilo with Simba, that could be a really powerful bit of synergy. Getting your exerted Lilo ready is going to make her significantly better. Also, if you have got those kinds of cards which are drawing and discarding of cards, things like Simba, things like Cinderella, if those kinds of cards can be good, Lilo becomes the best target in the game for them. So this card, in my opinion, is just going to continue to get better. Kind of been waiting for a card like this that rewards you to discard it from your hand, because of course a whole new world as well, Dock. So there's definitely some big synergy with Steel. I think Steel is the best home for Lilo on paper. But outside of that, you're going to have to play her down on the board if you want to summon her back later on. And she's pretty lackluster, right, for a card that you're playing from hand. She's not terrible. She still quests for 2. But if you look and compare her to Wendy Darling would be a 1/3 without that extra ability. So, when the turn you play her, she's significantly worse than Wendy Darling, who doesn't exactly see an abundance of competitive play. So I do think this card's going to be good, and I think it's going to have a home specifically in some kind of Amber Steel. I really like the idea of playing Simba, Lilo, and Pride Lands and Steel together, and having this kind of deck built around the Pride Lands and having some cost reduction. It's something I've been interested in for a while, and I think this card might be a big step in the right direction as well as Simba. So definitely one to keep an eye on. Of course, Pride Lands also gives you that cost reduction to get this Simba Pride protected down sooner, quite thematic as well. But Lilo, I think, is not as good as people have been suggesting. Certainly when I first saw the card, I kind of thought it would be coming up from the discard for free. If that was the case, it would be insane. One of the best cards in the game. Very, very powerful ability. I have a feeling it's not going to be that good initially and might get better as we get more cards. I think the more cards we get, the better this becomes. Our next, in the number 2 spot for Amber, and this is where we get into the real powerhouse cards. The next 2 cards are 2 of the best cards in the set, and this is Tiana, Restaurant Owner. Another legendary, 3rd legendary so far of the video. The Steel legendary we didn't talk about is an 8-cost inkable John Silver card, and it's just too expensive. But this Tiana is tremendous. Honestly, might be the best card of Amber. It's very, very possible. Whenever a character of yours is challenged while this character is exerted, The challenging character gets -3 strength this turn unless their player pays 3 ink. So a big problem, and any aggro deck tends to have, because this is a card that's going to be great in an aggro deck. The earlier on in the game, the better this is, because that 3 ink is going to be way more costly for your opponent, of course. In any like aggro deck, your biggest nightmare is Madam Mim Fox, because you play you play your normal aggro game plan, and then with their snake, they challenge your Lilo, and then they rush in, bouncing the snake back to hand with the fox, and they take out another one of your characters, and they still have this big fox on the board. And it's just a huge momentum shift and a big issue for aggro decks. Well, with Tiana on 3, suddenly, if you're going first, before they can get that fox through, if they want to rush in with a fox, it's only going to deal 1 damage unless they have 6 ink, which of course they can't because they've just rushed in with a fox. So Tiana just gives you so much value. Okay, maybe I was slightly wrong in what I said, because you can't actually have your Tiana exerted until turn 4 because she has to be exerted for that to work. Excuse me. But the point remains. The power level of this card is huge. So much potential, making things incredibly awkward for your opponents in the early game. It's a card which we'll see play in aggro decks for sure. But even outside of aggro decks, it's a card which I think has big, big potential. Great stats. 1/4 questing for 2 is really, really impressive. It's got all the right stats in all the right places. And the ability is phenomenally strong. So I really expect this one to be good. But, in my opinion, the best card in Amber for the set is the Sugar Rush Speedway Finish Line. A location, that's right. And it's a super rare location. It's a 2-cost uninkable, and I've actually played against this card. I can tell you firsthand, I've been destroyed by this card. How? You might ask, how have I played against this set 6 card? Well, I was at Disney Lorcana Challenge Seattle last week, and some of the Ravensburger game developers were using decks with set 6 cards, which I thought was really, really cool. Not in the tournament itself, of course, just at the free-to-play area, which I think was really, really awesome. And I played against Tim from the German Ravensburger team, someone I know quite well, and he was playing a Ruby Amber location deck focused around the Sugar Rush Speedway, and he got 3 of these off against me in the game, which meant he gained 9 lore and drew 9 cards from his Sugar Rush Speedways, and they cost a total of 6 ink between them, because it's a 2-cost uninkable. It costs a ton to move there, but there are ways in Disney Lorcana to move to locations for free. 7 willpower is a lot. When you move a character from another location, so the character has to be at a different location first and then move to the finish line, you gain 3 lore, draw 3 cards, and banish this. One of the other cards we're going to be looking at actually in Ruby, I'll see if I can pull it up quickly now as well, because I do think this is going to be best in Amber Ruby. Card we're going to be looking at in a little while in Ruby is Minnie Mouse Pirate Lookout, who is able to put your Sugar Rush Speedway from your discard back into your hand. So that's something to bear in mind. There's big synergy potentially with being able to replay this multiple times. And if you've got an abundance of locations, you move from one location to this, you're not going to spend 6 ink. Instead, you're going to play cards like Tuk Tuk, which moves itself and another card of yours to a location for free. And Tuk Tuk's a great card. Really strong card from a previous set. There just hasn't been any good enough locations for it to see competitive play. So Sugar Rush Speedway, Ruby Amber locations. You've got Rapunzel for card draw potentially onto things like Mother Gothel, of course, in that color combination. It's going to be good. Ruby Amber is back and better than ever. I expect this to be a very strong meta deck. If it isn't, it's not because of this card, but the rest of the support cards aren't quite there. But I have a feeling it might be one of the best decks around. I think this card is incredible. Really excited for this one. Moving on to Sapphire. Controversial first pick for the 5th best card of Sapphire. I don't think anybody else on YouTube would have picked this card. Honestly, there might be a better card, but I just had to pick Baymax Armored Companion. This is my kind of sentimental pick, if you like, because it's just a card I'm so excited for. Baymax Armored Companion is a legendary card which, when you play this character and whenever he quests, you may remove up to 2 damage from another chosen character of yours and gain 1 lore for each 1 damage removed this way. So if you manage to remove 2 damage, you gain 2 lore as soon as you play it, which is pretty strong in its own right. Of course, there's not that many use cases you might argue for that. Like, what are you really going to play this in? Well, you could play it with Mr. Smee, for example, in a Sapphire Steel deck, rather than playing Cogsworth on turn number 5, Baymax comes through and heals your Smee up. You gain 2 lore and your Smee is going to stick around on the board. And then the next turn, your Smee takes another damage and your Baymax can quest and gain another lore. So there's some cool synergy there. But moreover, in some kind of Grand Pabby build, I think this card is perhaps giving that kind of archetype, which is basically healing to win the game instead of questing. With Grand Pabby, whenever you heal something, you gain 2 lore. With Baymax and Grand Pabby down, you can do so much lore gain from Baymax heal. So it might not necessarily prove to be that good because the deck that it's in isn't that good, but I think the card itself is very, very strong. The fact that it does something when you play it and when it quests is music to my ears in terms of a card. I love cards which do something as soon as I play them and they're still a big threat. Like even if this gets brawled, it's still trading up to brawl because you healed something for 2 and gain 2 lore, ideally. I mean, if you're playing this card, you're probably building your entire deck around it, right? So the big question really with Baymax is how good is the deck it's going to be in? And that is a big question mark. But it's a card I really love the look of, and it's one I'm really, really excited for. So I had to talk about it. In at the 4th spot, Sapphire's got some incredible cards. Helping Hand, another controversial pick, I think. I asked my chat yesterday to give this a rating out of 10, and a lot of people were quite low on it. But then my opinion is it's incredible. If you think about the support keyword in Disney Lorcana, whenever a character card with support is released, the stats of the card are somewhat lackluster, and that's because the support keyword is actually very, very powerful. You can often, with this, for example, right? You give your Mr. Smee support, let's say. Mr. Smee seems to be the theme of today's video. You give your Mr. Smee support for 1 ink and you draw a card, so it replaces itself. Your Smee's questing, which it was already going to do, and suddenly your Mickey Mouse with a 1-3 stat line, the Sapphire from set 1, 1-3 stat line Mickey, which is usually a bit useless, suddenly has 4 strength this turn thanks to this Helping Hand of Mr. Smee. And it replaced itself? That's a big deal. It's a very, very big deal. I think this card is incredibly strong. It is uninkable, but you're playing Sapphire. How difficult is it going to be to just have that 1 ink spare? Really, really think this card's going to impress a lot of people, and I expect it to be very competitive. Up next, we have Tadashi Hamada. This is a 3-cost uninkable. This is in spot number 3 for Sapphire, the Gifted Roboticist. 2/2, quest for 2. During an opponent's turn, whenever this character is banished, you may put the top card of your deck into your Inkwell face down. Then put this card into your Inkwell face down. So quite similar to Grammatala, I think from the first chapter, which when it's banished, it goes into the Inkwell. But even better than that, it's also putting the top card of your deck. So it's like a Mickey Mouse and a Grammatala mixed together. A downside of this is that when you play it, you don't gain ramp instantly, only when it's banished. So in theory, your opponent could just ignore Tadashi Hamada, but then it's questing for 2 every single turn. So chances are your opponent's going to try and deal with it as quickly as possible. You might gain 2 lore for it, and then you gain also 2 ink to use later on in the game. So I think this card's very, very interesting. What's awkward about it, of course, is 3 cost for Sapphire. Usually you want to ramp on that turn. You want to play Fishbone Quill, you want to play Mickey Mouse, and then you want to play your things like Tinkerbell, Cogsworth as soon as possible. Tadashi fits a little bit of a different theme. A deck which wants to quest quite quickly and doesn't necessarily need to ramp early, but maybe wants to ramp later. Perhaps it could enable you to play Wreck-It Ralph, for example, in a deck which doesn't play Fishbone Quill or something like this and just wants to quest quickly. Very, very interesting card, but also a little bit awkward in terms of what we tend to see with Sapphire decks. Like Sapphire decks which play 3-cost characters which quest haven't really ever worked, but maybe this card is going to enable some of those to be a bit better. In number 2 spot, a card that was revealed many, many months ago because it was in the D23 set, and it's Oswald. Can you believe it's not in spot 1? It's another legendary card. So 5 out of the 6 legendary cards that could have been in this video are in it so far, which is really showing you there's a lot of very strong legendary cards in this set. Favorable chance during your turn, whenever a card is put into your Inkwell, you may reveal the top card of your deck. If it's an item card, you may play that item for free, and it enters play exerted, otherwise put it on the bottom of your deck. Wow. That's right, if you've got a Lucky Dime on top of your deck and an Oswald down on the board and you ink, you get a Lucky Dime on the board for free. Any quest for 2, insane card. We've talked a lot about Oswald in the past. I'm sure lots of you have heard people talk about it. So we're going to move on because it got revealed 3 months ago, but an insane card. The question mark really is how many items do you need in your deck to make this actually worth it? And there's a lot of competition at 2 cost in Sapphire. Now we've got Cheater as well, but I think this card is bonkers. But the best card, arguably, of the whole entire set in Sapphire, but arguably the entire set itself, is Sail the Azurite Sea. And this turn, you may put an additional card from your hand into your inkwell and draw a card. So you draw first and then you can ink. Even though it's written in the reverse order, it's important to note that you can draw first and then ink that extra card afterwards. And you can also play Sail the Azurite Sea before you've inked even your first card. And you can also play 2 Sail the Azurite Seas in a single turn to ink 3 cards. Very, very strong. Very few downsides. If you think about the biggest downsides of cards like One Jump Ahead and Tipo, for example, if you draw into them later, they're terrible. If you draw into Sail the Azurite Sea later, while it's not great to spend 2 ink to draw a card, well, you've got an abundance of ink because you're playing Sapphire, so who cares? It's much better than drawing One Jump Ahead or Tipo, isn't it? Incredible card. I think it might be a little bit busted. I'm not sure this card should have been inkable, to be honest. I think it could have been uninkable and still would have been very good. A little bit scared about this card, to be honest. I think if you look, it's just going to be played in every Sapphire deck. I don't see a world it's not. Having said that, there's already a lot of very good Sapphire cards that ramp. Tipo, for example. Is this competing with Tipo? Is it worse than Tipo? Well, you could argue that Tipo is better against aggro decks. In fact, it's not even an argument. Tipo is better against aggro decks. So maybe, even though Sail the Azurite Sea is giving the deck, like a Ruby Sapphire deck, more power overall, it makes it weaker to some of its counter decks. So that's worth noting. Great card. I expect it to be seeing play ×4 in every Sapphire deck. And there's a reason it's a common card, because Ravensburger want people to be able to get this card easily. Don't want it to be a $30 card, because if it was legendary, it would be very expensive. Very, very expensive. All right, up next we've got Ruby. Another controversial pick. I've gone for Energy Blast. It's a 7-cost uninkable action, which is absurd. Thank goodness it's not a 6-cost action, because if it was, Robin Hood Sharpshooter would be able to play it for free, and that would be broken. This is a Dragonfire that also allows you to draw a card, and I think that's a pretty big deal. I really, really do. Banish chosen character and draw a card. I like the sound of that quite a bit. I mean, if you look at like Maleficent Monstrous Dragon, it's kind of comparable to that, right? Okay, it's uninkable, but it costs 2 less, and instead of having this big body, you draw a card. I think it's got big potential. I don't think it's a card you're ever going to play 4 copies of, but I think it's a card that you play 1, maybe 2 copies of. It could be good. Another card we're going to be looking at in just a moment as well is able to put this from your discard back into your hand, and there's some big synergy potentially there. Up next, we have the Minnie Mouse Pirate Lookout. This is a card which I expect to see play in that Ruby Amber deck. We already looked at it. Once during your turn, whenever a card is put into your inkwell, you may return a location card from your discard to your hand. That's really good, because even if you're just putting a inkable location from your discard into your hand to ink for the next turn, right, it could be pretty good. Not the most impressive stats, but I think it's a nice bit of support for the Sugar Rush Speedway. That's the main reason it's in here. Our next, Tigger. Honestly, there's quite a lot of Ruby cards I could have picked. Tigger's a card that does interest me. It might prove to be not that good, but I do like the look of it. Whenever you play an action, this character gets +1 strength and +1 law this turn. If you play 19 actions in one turn, Tigger quests for 20. I'm just saying, all right? I'm just saying. So instantly what jumps to mind is obviously Robin Hood Sharpshooter, Ursula Deceiver of All. If you sing an action, I think singing a song still counts as playing an action, right? Because all songs are actions. So if you sing something with Ursula, Tigger's suddenly questing for 3. Pretty big deal. It might not be that good though. Excuse me, I got hiccups, but this is a cool card. I wanted to draw attention to it. Moana, the Self-Taught Sailor. As you can see, like Ruby maybe doesn't have the best cards overall. Like Tigger would not have made the cut in a lot of the other ones, but Moana, incredible card. This character can't challenge unless you have a captain character in play. That's a big downside, but who cares, because it's an inkable 3/2 that quests for 1. Very unique card. We haven't seen any stat lines like this on a 1-cost character, and importantly, very importantly, is the ink color that it's in. Ruby, before Moana, had not a single competitively viable one-cost character at all. I'm pretty sure. I don't think there's a single one-cost Ruby character which sees any form of competitive play. Whenever I build Ruby Emerald decks, for example, one of the biggest problems is I have to rely on those Emerald one-cost characters, which there isn't that many of. There's Cursed Merfolk and Pegasus in previous sets. Well, now suddenly, if I want to build a Ruby Emerald deck, I've also got the option of Moana. Okay, she's going to be best if you've got a captain on turn 2. Mr. Smee is not a captain. I was going to say Mr. Smee comes to mind. But who really cares? Even if you quest and a Madam Mim Fox wants to try and remove this, the Fox gets traded out by your one-cost character. That is absurd. I think this card is fantastic, particularly because of the ink color that it is in. If this card was in Amethyst, I would still be interested in it, and I would probably still include it in the list, but it wouldn't probably see that much play because there's so many good one-cost characters in Amethyst. But Ruby has none. This is the first good Ruby one-cost character, in my opinion, and it's also a very good one. So I think this one's going to see a lot of play. I don't think I'll see play in Ruby Amethyst, as I mentioned. I think Amethyst has got so many one-drops, but in other Ruby decks, Ruby Emerald, for example, this makes a monumentally big difference to those kinds of decks. But in spot number 1, it's Maui the Half Shark. Another legendary, everybody. Another legendary. Trying to think what the other Ruby legendary card is that we haven't talked about. It's a Hades card, which is absolutely pants. So we're, I think 4 out of 6 legendaries, or 6 out of 8 rather. Legendary cards, which is really showing you there's a lot of good legendaries in this. It's evasive. It's got 7 strength and 5 willpower. It's a pretty good start. Whenever this character challenges another character, you may return an action card from your discard to your hand. And whenever you play an action, gain 1 lore. You guys know me. I love Robin Hood Sharpshooter. It was my favourite card from the previous set, and it's possible that Maui Half Shark might be the perfect match for Robin Hood Sharpshooter. Robin Hood Sharpshooter is putting a bunch of cards in the discard. Maui can put those back into your hand and is gaining you lore whenever you play an action. So, for example, you could maybe build a deck with Ruby and Amethyst, because when you think Robin Hood Sharpshooter, a lot of you are going to instantly think Ruby Emerald, but there's much more potential now, I think, that Maui exists. It's a huge payoff to play a action-heavy deck. Imagine, for example, you play Ruby Amethyst, you play Maui on turn 6, and then on turn 7, you play cards like It Calls Me, which is a 1-cost action and song, which replaces itself. You put a card from your opponent's discard into their deck, and you draw a card. So you just pay 1 to draw a card. Oh, look, Maui gained a lore. So in other words, you pay 1 to gain a lore with Maui on the board. And if you've got 2 Mauis, it will be 2 lore. Bam, bam, bam. You can do all sorts of cool things with this card. Really, really impressive. 6 cost is a lot, though. So I think Maui's going to be best if you're able, again, to ramp into it. I think Amber Ruby could be interesting, again, with Lantern. Ruby Sapphire, probably not. Like, you're probably going to go a different route. But I think Amber Ruby could make use of Maui with, like, an action-heavy deck and Robin Hood Sharpshooter. The question is there enough good actions there for it to work? Ruby Amethyst is another one I'm really interested in with Maui, as I've just mentioned. So this card just looks like so much fun to play. Little bit of synergy there with this Energy Blast card I was talking about as well. Very, very powerful card. If you only have 1 copy of this in your deck, right, then your Maui just goes on a challenge, puts the Energy Blast back in hand, and then BAM! Your Energy Blast removes something from the board and draws you a card. Like, there's huge potential with Maui. Putting things back like Hypnotize if you need that discard at a specific moment. Putting things back like We Don't Talk About Bruno. Maybe putting like Friends on the Other Side back in hand. All kinds of powerful things to do with Maui Half Shark. Really cool card. Very, very excited for it. Up next, we've got Emerald. Emerald had, for me, Emerald and Amethyst, which are the last 2 we're looking at, were the hardest ones to just pick 5 cards. There was a lot of cards I wanted to pick for both Emerald and Amethyst. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the best cards, rather that they just have the highest density of good cards. And Prince Philip is a character with Ward that quests for 2. And that's kind of all you need to know. It can't be removed by Ice Block Sisu, right? That's pretty good. There's also a 4-cost card with a very similar stat line. It just has 1 extra willpower, doing the same thing with Ward that's coming out. And there's another Ward card in Emerald, which we are going to be looking at in the video. But Prince Philip's pretty good. Not the most amazing, but it's easy to underestimate the ward keyword, right? Especially in some kind of, like, Prince Philip's best in just a deck which just wants to quest and have guaranteed quests. Like, if you draw Prince Philip off the top of your deck and you're at 18 lore, your opponent's not going to be very happy about it, right? So I think Prince Philip's just very, very solid. Up next, we've got Owl Island. Now, Owl Island is seemingly the most important card of the set from a story perspective, and I'm going to be covering the Azurite Sea story in a video later this week, so make sure you are subscribed for that if you're excited. Owl Island, the most important card of the story, because seemingly it's what is at the end of the maze. Like, there's a big maze, there's big ships that are sailing the Azurite Sea, and at the end of the Azurite Sea is Owl Island, and it's very strong. It's a location that's uninkable, which is never a great start, but we're starting to get into the territory of some really wacky locations in Lorcana. Most of the locations we've seen are things like Queen's Castle, which are played because they gain lore quickly and don't necessarily use their ability. Queen's Castle is kind of the exception, right? That its ability was very strong. Well, Owl Island doesn't gain any lore, which is always a big red flag. However, its ability allows you to gain lore. So for each character you have here, you pay 1 ink less for the first action you play each turn. That has a lot of potential. Obviously, you could pay like less for a whole new world. You could pay whatever it might be, less for Bruno, less for Hypnotize. Like if you've got 5 ink and 2 Hypnotizes in hand, and Owl Island, suddenly you could go 1 for you go 2 for Hypnotize, and then 3 for the next Hypnotize, discard both. And obviously, if you have multiple characters here, it becomes even cheaper. So there's some really cool things going on there. And whenever you play a second action in a turn, gain 3 lore. So what's very interesting is, in theory, this card can also gain lore the turn you play it, right? You play Owl Island, you play 2 actions, bam, gain 3 lore the turn it's played. That's pretty exciting. And the other thing is, like, the teamwork ability. Like, both these abilities are synergizing together. They work together. And for each character you have here, you pay 1 ink less for the first action you play each turn. So you pay 1 to move a character into Owl Island, but then you gain that 1 ink back the very same turn with that cost reduction of the next action. So if you've got, for example, a Hypnotize in hand, which you want to play, rather than just spending 3 ink on Hypnotize, what you should do is you should just move as many characters as you can, let's say 3, into Owl Island, and then you'll spend 0 for that Hypnotize, because then next turn, if the Owl Island's still on the board, those 3 characters within Owl Island are going to make your next turn cheaper. So the teamwork ability basically pays for itself, and the A Lot to Learn ability is just very, very strong. And it's got decent stats with 6 willpower. It's a very, very interesting card. No doubt about it. Potential of some Ruby Emerald location decks as well. Potential of some Amber Emerald location decks. My gut feeling is the best one's going to be Amber Ruby, as I've already mentioned. But this card's very cool. And maybe you could even play it without any other locations, right? Just this is the only location. Play a couple of them. It's a very exciting card. Up next, we've got Basil, the Disguised Detective. During your turn, whenever a card is put into your inkwell, you may pay 1 ink to have chosen opponent choose and discard a card. Now you can do that multiple times a turn. The usual sort of play format, or the usual cycle, I can't really think of the right phrasing. The usual play pattern of a discard deck is maybe Curse Merfolk on 1, maybe Diablo on 1, and then you just slowly start whittling away at your opponent's resources with Prince John and things like Sudden Chills and Hypnotize and maybe a Friar Tuck, these kinds of things. Basil, Disguised Detective, changes that potentially, and it gives you a way of playing a discard deck which doesn't have to discard in the early game, because you instead can focus your early turns on being greedy with your resources, Sapphire, in other words, ramping up to Basil, having an abundance of ink, and then Basil hits the board for 6, less if you shift it. Shifting would be tremendous with this card. Let's say you shift it in, and then bam, you pay 2 ink, and your opponent has to discard 2 cards. Bam, you pay a 3rd ink, they discard a 3rd card. All their cards are gone. Maybe you had a Prince John on the board, and then you're probably winning the game from there. So Basil Disguised Detective is very, very interesting because it allows you to play a discard deck in Sapphire Emerald, which previously was not possible. And It's a card which you could just play like randomly in a random Emerald Sapphire deck, which isn't even focused on discard. And out of nowhere, if you're at 9 ink, you could just play it down and instantly discard your opponent's 3 cards from nowhere. And added to that, its stats are not bad. 4/5, quest for 2. Maui is able to remove it while remaining on the board, so that's quite a big deal. But it's just very, very solid, isn't it? Out of Medusa range, it's got big potential, that's for sure. Up next, we've got Goofy, the Expert Shipwright. This is the second best card, in my opinion, of the set for Emerald. And it's Ward, and when it quests, it gives Ward to another character. I will mention there's another Sapphire card, very, very similar to Goofy, which didn't get a mention and probably should have. It was Alice. There's an Alice card in Sapphire with a very similar ability. She was the one I kind of left out because I really wanted to talk about Baymax. But Alice in Wonderland in Sapphire, very, very similar ability and very, very strong. But Goofy being inkable, 5-cost inkable for Emerald is like the perfect threshold because Emerald does struggle for card draw. You can just plug and play this in an Emerald deck like Emerald Ruby, which has a very big lack of card draw, and there's so much you can do with this. For example, I'm going to use the Robin Hood Sharpshooter example again. You go for Goofy on 5, and then on turn 4 you play Robin Hood Sharpshooter and you give it Ward, and suddenly it can't be removed by Brawl, it can't be removed by Sisu, etc. Well, at least the human Sisu. And yeah, it's just great. Like even just giving, I don't know, Gantu, the card that quests for 4 Ward, anything like that is just very, 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 very powerful. It quests for 3. It's very difficult to deal with. It's a good card. It's a very, very good card indeed. And finally, the best card, in my opinion, of the set for Emerald, a controversial pick. It is Honey Lemon, the Chemical Genius. Now, what I want to make clear on why I think Honey Lemon is the best card in the set for Emerald is not necessarily because I think the card is that good itself. It's more that it fills a role which Emerald decks are looking for so desperately. Bear in mind, I'm kind of known in some circles as like the Emerald guy, right? Like if you had to associate me with a single ink color, it's Emerald. It's discard. So I play a lot of Emerald. I build a lot of Emerald decks, and Honey Lemon is the card I've been looking for, essentially. I don't think the card is necessarily that good in its own right. It's just that it fills a role which I think is going to make Emerald discard decks much, much better, which is simply really that it's just another card which says discard, right? If you look at Zan Syed's Emerald Steel, which was very, very popular in set 5, you have Hypnotize, you have Sudden Chill, you've got Arna, which was added as well, which just says discard a card. None of these cards say discard a card next turn, right? They discard instantly. That's very, very important. The play pattern, again, is you want to discard your opponent's hand as quickly as possible. And Honey Lemon is just another card which allows you to do that, which is great. If your opponent's got one card in hand and you top deck Honey Lemon with a Prince John on the board, that wins you the game, right? It really, really does. But added to that, even if you don't go for the discard, this card's just very solid. If you've already discarded your opponent's hand, you could play 2 Honey Lemons for 4 instead and threaten 4 lore. Very, very strong. I think this card's absolutely incredible and is going to see a whole bunch of competitive play and going to make the Emerald discard archetype even stronger than it already is. With one exception, which is Amber Emerald. I don't think this makes the cut in Amber Emerald. Amber Emerald is a deck which has an abundance of discard options with You Have Forgotten Me. It's also that 4-cost Daisy Duck. I actually cooked up a Amber Emerald aggro discard deck for Seattle, which I ended up not playing because it kind of sucked a little bit. But it was almost good. It had some cool things going on. And a big reason for that was because Amber simply had more cards which said discard. But now with Honey Lemon, you've got the option to just have even more discard cards in every single Emerald deck that plays Prince John. And Prince John's the best card in Emerald. And Honey Lemon is a great addition to those decks. So that's why I think it's so, so good. Not because the card is particularly that strong in its own right. It is. But more so because of the impact it's going to have. It's also in the starter deck. Now, last one's Amethyst. Amethyst has so many good cards, which I couldn't include them all. But we're going to start off with the White Rose. When you play this character, gain 1 lore. It's a 3-cost goat. It doesn't gain lore when it leaves play, but it's got decent stats. It only quests for 1, but it's almost guaranteeing you 2 lore. Pretty good. Maleficent Staff. It's an item. Whenever one of your opponent's characters, items, locations is returned to their hand from play, gain 1 lore. Maleficent Stuff also has an enchanted. Big potential in a emerald and amethyst deck where you build around this card entirely. Combining it with things like Mother Knows Best, Mother Gothel, the Muses, Emerald Chromicon to bounce your opponent's cards back into their hand to gain you lore. If you've got multiple of these items, imagine you've got 2 down. Every time you play a Mother Knows Best, gain 2 lore as well. That sounds pretty tasty. Worth mentioning, this card isn't just going to be played necessarily in Emerald and Amethyst decks, because let's say traditional Ruby Amethyst that we all know and love is the best deck in the game in set 6, which I don't think it will be, but hypothetically, let's say, and there's mirrors everywhere. This card's going to be incredible in a mirror, because there's no item removal in Ruby Amethyst decks, and your opponent's going to be bouncing cards. So this is kind of going to help you in mirror matchups as well against other Amethyst decks. But I think you could build a really good deck around this with Emerald Amethyst, or at least I think there's the potential to do so, and it's a really, really good card for that reason. Up next, I have what I was quoted on my stream yesterday as saying is the best card in Disney Lorcana, and I've only put it in the 3rd spot. Which, this all sounds a bit odd, but let me explain myself. This is Diablo, the Obedient Raven. It's a 0/1 which quests for 1, and when this character is banished, you may draw a card. Very similar to Chernobog's Followers and Magic Brooms, which, as my regular viewers will know, are, in my opinion, 2 of the best cards in the game, and I would argue that Diablo is better than both of them. Why is this card and Chernobog's and Magic Brooms so strong, in my opinion? It's because it's never bad. There's no situation particularly that Diablo is bad unless it gets like hit by Let It Go or something, and I don't think that's going to happen ever. Because of course, if it gets hit by Let It Go, it's not banished but put into the inkwell. So if you draw Diablo on turn 1, okay, cool. You have a 1-drop that can quest for 1, and if it gets banished, it draws a card in a similar way to Kuzco. But instead of Kuzco being a 2 cost, it's 1 cost. Similarly, if you draw Diablo on turn 1 and you have a better 1 cost card, you want to play like a Maleficent, bam, you can ink it if you really want to. If you are on turn 6 and you want to play a Maui and you have 1 ink spare, you can play your Diablo down, you can quest for 1, it's going to get banished, and then it's going to replace itself. That's the important thing, it replaces itself. It's inkable, it doesn't matter that its stats are terrible, it's just never, ever bad. And I actually have a feeling, a pretty strong suspicion, my intuition tells me, if I'm going to build an Amethyst deck right now, if I had to play an Amethyst deck right now, and you would say, Speci, build the best Amethyst deck possible using all the cards from set 6 and before, I would start the deck off, first 4 cards in the deck would be 4 copies of this. It really would. I would then probably also put 4 copies of Chernobyls, 4 copies of Brooms, and maybe 4 copies of Friends on the other side. Probably be my starting point. I think this card is that good. So why have I therefore not put it higher? Because also, let's not forget, it's a Diablo shift target. It's actually the second 1-cost Diablo in Amethyst. The other one is not very good. But you can now, in theory, play a Amethyst Emerald Diablo deck that has 12... well, actually 16 shift targets, right? Because you could play the Diablo from Emerald, this Diablo, the other Diablo from Amethyst, that's 12, and you could also play Morph. So in theory, you could have 16. But 12 1-drop shift targets means the Diablo Emerald has got a lot of potential in terms of consistency. I will mention that Diablo is much worse in Amethyst compared with Steel, because being able to sing Let the Storm Rage On, I think, is much higher impact than being able to sing Frenzy on the other side early. But singing Friends isn't so bad at all, is it really? So why is this only in 3rd place then? If I'm saying this is the best card in the game, which is a bit of an outlandish statement, and I say that about a lot of cards, so, you know, just keep a pinch of salt. I'm a YouTuber. I like to exaggerate, all right? But I really do think that this is the best card in the game. My kind of like deck building brain just tells me that this has to go in every Amethyst deck. But why then, if I think this is the best card in the game, is it only in 3rd place for Amethyst for this set? Because that doesn't really make any sense. It's because it's not going to have that big of an impact, because the other cards, which this is likely to replace, are incredibly similar and already very, very strong. Magic Broom, Chernobog's Followers, as I've said in my opinion, 2 of the very best cards. In fact, I've been on record saying, if not the best cards in the game. And Diablo's doing the same. So why do I think Diablo is better than Chernobog's and Magic Broom, even though it has worse stats. Well, Chernobog's and Magic Brooms, the play patterns, bear in mind I played both these cards in Disney Lorcana Challenge Seattle very recently as well, cards I got a lot of experience with. The key thing with Chernobog's and Magic Brooms is that you need to quest with them as much as possible, but then pick your moment to draw with them. You're in control, right? Which that gives Magic Brooms and Chernobog's a incredibly high skill ceiling, where it's, in my opinion, two of the hardest cards to play perfectly in the game, if not the hardest. I think the skill ceiling on these cards is insane. I've seen a top 16 Disney Lorcana Challenge game where, in my opinion, someone made a misplay with the Chernobog's. Like, they drew with it too soon, in my opinion. So I think for even some of the very, very best players, those cards are very, very difficult to maximize. Diablo isn't. Diablo doesn't have that issue where you have to decide when to draw with it, because your opponent has to answer it. With the Chernobog's and the Brooms, you're in control. Before your opponent's able to challenge you, you draw. Whereas with Diablo, you don't have to worry about that. So you can just quest, do your thing, and then your opponent's going to have to, rather than questing themselves at some point, challenge your Diablo, which is slowing your opponent down when compared with Chernobog's and Brooms. Now, on the flip side, the downside of that is that with the Chernobog's and the Brooms, you can draw with them when you want, in particular the Magic Broom, and you can't with Diablo. So that's a downside. But what you could always do, if you really just need a draw for your Diablo and your opponent's just leaving it, you can always just go on a suicide mission and challenge your Diablo into one of your opponent's cards and remove it that way. So instead of just gaining a lore, drawing a card in that sense. So it's a really interesting card. I absolutely love the design of this one. My gut feeling is Amethyst should be playing 4 Chernobog's, 4 Diablos, and 4 Magic Brooms. Let me know what you think. Card number 2 for Amethyst. Madam Mim, truly marvelous. Weird card. Very weird card, but I think it might prove to be a little bit bonkers. It's a 3-cost non-inkable with a 2/3 stat line and quest for 1, and you can spend 2 ink to choose and discard a card and gain a lore. Important to note, before you panic, that is not your opponent's cards. That is one of your own cards. So you can discard one of your own cards to gain a lore. Especially that doesn't sound that good. Well, imagine you're at 15 lore with a Amethyst deck which just draws 1 million cards, and you have 6 cards in hand. You play Madam Mim, bam, 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 bam. You got a bunch of ink. You just keep tapping, and it's like a goat, right? It's like lore that your opponent can't stop. That is why this card is going to be so good in my opinion. It's not a card you're going to play 4 copies of. But even if it's just a card you play 2 copies of, if you can find it at the right time, it's going to win a lot of games. And I think it's going to be a really, really interesting card, and one which sees a lot of competitive play, and a card which is going to win a lot of games. So I think it's really, really strong. It's a super rare. But for me, the best card in Amethyst, not including Diablo, is Ysma, another legendary card. My goodness, this card's so good. I actually watched Emperor's New Groove the other day, and there's also an Enchanted of this Ysma that might be my chase card of the set. I love Ysma. She's such a cool character. Incredible voice acting on that one in the movie. 4-cost, inkable, 3/3 stat line, quest for 2. Feel the power. If you have fewer than 3 cards in your hand, draw until you have 3 cards in your hand. Wow. So you can exert her. If you don't want to, you can just quest, and she's really not that bad. Like, if she costs 1 less, that would be a vanilla stat line with no ability, right? Mickey Mouse from the first chapter is a 3-cost card with 3/3 quest for 2. So for 1 extra ink, you get this potential ability, and what an ability it is. For an aggro deck, aggro decks run out of steam quite quickly. You don't really want to take a whole turn using something like Friends on the other side or Singing Friends. It can feel a bit awkward. But with that Ysma, you've got the option of questing, but then if you're really desperate for some cards, you can take that exertion. But it's not only going to be good in aggro decks either. I think it's just going to be pretty good across the board with the right style of deck. Really strong. I think in Amethyst Steel with Doc, it's got potential. I think it's got a lot to like about it. Big honorable mention to some other Amethyst cards. Magic Carpet, which is a 1/3 3-cost card, which quests 4/3. There's also a Tinkerbell in Amethyst, which has the same stats as Minnie Mouse Stylish Surfer. I wanted to include both of those, but they didn't quite make it. So those are my 30 best cards of Azurite Sea, but specifically 5 from each ink color. What card did I not talk about? Because I'm sure there are some, right? The set isn't out yet, so I'm sure there's some cards that I've brushed over. What card have I not mentioned which you think I should have talked about. Do you agree with my takes? Is there anything you disagree with? Big shout out again to Card Market for sponsoring the channel. Thank you so much for that. Going to be a great place to buy your singles for Azurite Sea once the set is out. I would avoid buying singles before the set's actually out because pre-release prices seem to be higher than the cards will actually be. So that's just something worth bearing in mind. But really probably a good time right now to buy singles from previous sets. If you want to cook up some decks right now and you want... Oh, look, Robin Hood Sharpshooter's in the top 6. Let's go. I'm a happy man. Robin Hood Sharpshooter in the top 6. He's on the rise. He's on the rise. I've got 4 of these enchanted, so that's nice for me to see. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. See you all very, very soon. Bye now.